Every teacher tries to make sure that their classroom is conducive to the learning styles of their students. However, that can be difficult when you have so many needs of your students. In today's episode, I'm going to be interviewing a parent, and we are going to be doing part one of a two-part series where we are talking about dyslexia and sharing tips, strategies, and just insight into how, as a teacher, you can better support these students. Stay tuned. What's kicking, educational rock stars? Welcome back to the channel. The Center Fairy here, your ultimate source into the wonderful world of simple classroom systems. Now, if this is your first time joining me here today, I would love it if you would hit that like and that subscribe button and click that bell so that you get notified when I go live or upload a new video here on the channel.
Okay.
Welcome, Trina. Thank you so much for joining me today. Before we get started, could you just kind of tell my audience how long you've been an educator, what you're doing now? Can you just kind of tell us who you are?
I can. Okay. So my name is Trina Deboree, and I am a content creator from Trina Deboree Teaching and Learning. I have a podcast, One Tired Teacher. I have been in education since 1997.
Oh,
I know it's a long time. I taught first grade and then second grade for years and years. I was a student support specialist and a media specialist. And so I've had a variety of perspectives in the field of education. And now I've stepped out, but really hoping to support and help teachers get some of their time back and like get through some of these things and just do the best they can. My biggest goal is for kids to love to learn. And I know that we have teachers that care about that and want to instill that within all of their students.
well, I think today's episode is definitely going to stay along those lines because I've asked Trina here because of our topic and talking about dyslexia and how, as educators, we can help students in our classroom. And Trina, you are coming on as to give us the perspective of a parent. I know you're an educator, but I'm so excited to get the perspective from a parent because I think it's very important that we not just hear from the experts, but we hear from the other side and we hear from what it's like as the parent dealing with this. So thank you so much for being here today. I knew that this was going to be a very serious topic because I listen, I'm on mom talk, I'm on teacher talk, I'm on
Yeah.
teachergram and momgram and all of the socials, and I see how passionate
Mhm.
teachers who service these students as well as moms who have students with dyslexia, how passionate they get and
Yeah.
all of the things that that entails. And so I wanted to be very, very sensitive because it's not something that I, believe it or not, in my 25 years as an educator, have ever had to deal with. I've never had, well, I can't say I've never had a student. I've had students who we believed had some
Mhm.
form of dyslexia or had
Mhm.
some, was dealing with some of that. But it was one of those things that we just got the testing started. So I never actually had students that I was formally teaching with dyslexia. And
Mhm.
before I go any further, uh, would you mind, and just for my audience, you are going to be helping us today as a parent, as
Mm.
an educator, but also as
Mhm.
a parent.
As a parent.
And
Okay.
would you help us and my audience who may not know or really have dealt with this?
Mhm.
How is it that you refer to your child, to your student? Are they
Mhm.
a child with dyslexia or are they a dyslexic child? That's something that I know that comes up a lot. So,
Yeah, that's interesting.
kinda share that with me.
I I say that he has dyslexia. I don't know if I ever say I'm sure I say he's dyslexic. I don't really those 2 neither like, I don't think of it as a bad thing, so it
Okay.
doesn't feel like a heavy label. I mean, I am dyslexic,
Okay.
and so myself and my son was diagnosed in 1st grade, and I will say one thing, like, we actually even if we don't think we've ever dealt with it in our
Yes.
classroom, we have, because it, impacts and there's 2 different schools of thought, and one set of research will say 1 in 5 children are impacted, and then one will say 1 in 10. So no matter what, even if it's 1 in 10 or 1 in 5, you have someone, at least 1, maybe 2, possibly 4 kids in your class that actually fall on some type of dyslexic spectrum, which I do feel like there is a spectrum because I think my daughter also is dyslexic, but she was never identified and she just
Mhm.
overcompensated so well until we got to the SAT. And then it was like the time factor was something that she couldn't overcome. And so it was difficult. It was, I mean, we're talking about a 4.2 grade point average, top 10% of her class. And she had like an average SAT score and couldn't get into the schools in Florida that really focus on that, unfortunately, which is a whole nother story. But so I don't really say, he's dyslexic or he has dyslexia. I guess I say both. I really that's kind of interchangeable for me.
Well, that's interesting. And the reason that comes up, I think, is because I know, for example, in the autism community,
Mhm.
that is very, very much something that comes up with parents and educators and advocates of not labeling the child um, as their disability. And
Mhm.
I can see that. I can see that, but it's interesting to get that perspective as a mom, as an
Mhm.
educator, but as well as someone who also deals with
Who
and
ha
has to
Yes. I
deals
think
with
that
this
as
as well.
time has gone on, and I attribute this to, lots of research and also lots of people that have gone on and been very successful in life. It's not I don't necessarily look at it as a disability. And I mean, I feel like I maybe I did as a child, like I did there was a lot of my life where I didn't feel smart, where I felt dumb, where I felt like it was difficult for me. I had to work really, really hard
Right.
to get things. And I definitely noticed that with my son. I know it really impacts your self-esteem, but when we start to look at some of the benefits of having dyslexia, there are a lot. And now even LinkedIn is recognizing it as something positive. Like you can actually add dyslexic thinking to your profile. So you can proudly walk around as a divergent person, and it's okay. You no longer have to feel like, yes, maybe you struggled in the beginning, but you do learn to compensate and overcome. It's almost like a rewiring of your brain. I really feel like that because it impacts the language area of your brain. I do feel like there are ways where that you can kind of get around that and build these new, you know synapses, all that stuff. You can build those things in your brain and you're able to compensate and you're able to overcome.
So let's kind of like expand on that because
Mhm.
that is interesting. There have been many times that I've heard, whether it be a learning disability or, you know, a physical disability,
Mhm.
I've often heard people who deal with that disability refer to it as a benefit.
Mhm.
And it just makes me different. It doesn't, it's, and a lot of people I
Yeah.
think have even ex kind of turned it on, turned the tables and said, "This
Mhm.
is not a disability."
Mhm.
Which I think is a slippery slope because I do think there needs to be some acknowledgement that there needs to be services for
For sure.
this,
Because
but
because it is difficult in the beginning, but it really comes down to the fact that you think differently. And if we did more of this anyway in education, if we paid attention to different thinkers and the ways that kids learn differently, we would have a better grasp on this
yeah,
because it truly takes a multisensory approach when you are teaching children with dyslexia, and that's how they grasp content and so much better. And so if we did that for everyone,
right.
we would be reaching so many children. And I always felt like, even as an educator, if I could figure these things out, it would help my ELL students as well because of their language, their difficulty with language. And I'm like, this would really make such a huge difference. And it was the teachers that I had that paid attention to that kind of stuff that helped me. And with my son and even my daughter, they did better in classes where they were not just like sitting and getting. It was more hands-on, and they
Okay.
had audio options, or they had, things like that that made a difference. And also, I will say, and I have to give a shout out to this book. It's really old and there's probably a revised, but it's called The Gift of Dyslexia.
Uh-huh.
And it completely helped me see it as a gift
Well, go
because
ahead
you're
and show that
yeah,
cover so
okay.
that the audience can know which one to look at. The Gift of Dislike by Ronald Davis. Okay, we
Yeah.
will definitely I will grab a link. I'm assuming it's probably available off Amazon. I will
Yes.
grab a link and I will share that out. But
Yeah.
go ahead about the book. Sorry.
So no, it just changed the way that I looked at it. And also when I was like I said, I didn't feel very smart, and I know I'm talking about this like from a personal perspective, and I will talk about it as like a mom as well, but from a personal standpoint, I didn't feel like I mean, I did well in school. The only thing that I really struggled, I mean, I didn't in the beginning. Like it was hard for me to learn how to read, but I had a tutor that specialized in dyslexia, which in 1970 something is pretty shocking and,
Right?
but my grandparents paid a lot of money, and my grandmother worked with me every single day, so there were multiple people that were doing things to help me. But once what I always feel like as the light bulb went off, I couldn't get enough of reading. And I really feel and I used to tell my son this, I'm like, you if you're not practicing, if you're not rebuilding those pathways, it will always be difficult. And now I don't feel like I have like, it's not hard for me. I love to read. I read constantly and all the time. So I do feel like that's one thing that does matter, and the children that I've seen that have done better, like, in school have been the ones that are constantly reading and
Okay.
reading a lot, and so I think that that really does help, but I kinda lost my train. Oh, so I didn't feel like, like I was very smart, and I remember sitting in college and the University of South Florida. And I was like taking this child development course and they were talking about dyslexia. And I was like, huh. And at that time, they really felt like you couldn't even really be labeled if you weren't in the average to above average intelligence range. They're not saying that as much anymore. They're saying it that doesn't really have an impact. But I was like, wait a minute. That must mean that I am smart. And so I went home and I like found the report like from when I was tested. And I'm like, oh my gosh. It was just so shocking to see the things that were written about you and like to realize that some of like I couldn't decode words, but I had outstanding comprehension. They couldn't understand what I was saying, but I could tell them everything about the story and it was insightful, And so I'm like, wow. So it really even then though, I mean, I went on and did well in college, but it wasn't until I got my master's in 2011 and I experienced this I learned about Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence theory, and I was like and the way that they taught was so, like, optimal for my brain. I had, like, a 98%
Yeah.
average in my graduate program, and I graduated as a salutatorian, and I didn't even know what a salutatorian was, and until that happened, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I I actually am a little bit smart." So, it's
So
crazy.
that brings up a really good question because as an educator and as educators, um, well, for us at least, I'm going to say for me because I don't want to be insulting to my guest, but for me, it's been a while since we went through our teacher training. Or I said our, but anyway,
Yeah,
it's been a
me
while since
too.
I went through my teacher training. Um, and I know that that is a specialized training and not all teachers get it.
No.
But like you said, we have probably what was the statistic again about whether or not we've dealt with it in our
Oh,
classrooms?
1 in 5 or 1
1
in
in 5,
10.
1 in
Mhm.
10. That's a high statistic.
It
So,
is.
thinking that teachers need training in this
Mhm.
because when the average teacher hears dyslexia,
Mhm.
I would probably venture to say the one thing they think of, and probably the only thing they think of,
Reversals.
is reversals.
Yeah,
My
which is a
student writes their
misconception.
numbers backwards. My
Yep.
student writes their letters backwards. And I do know this because it was something that I dealt with very early on with a parent who was convinced their child um, was dyslexic and had dyslexia because they were a kindergartner who was writing their B's and D's backwards. And I knew
Mhm.
that that was developmental at that point.
Mhm.
We just need to watch things, but that's just like that's one thing.
Yeah.
So, can you kind of explain to the average teacher if you had to pick 5 main things, and I know there's probably a laundry list of things, but if you had to pick 5 main ones that are just probably clear, blatant, you probably need to get this is probably something going on here, even
Mhm.
though we would never diagnose our students, what would those 5 things be?
Okay, so if I had to say 5 things, I know it always comes to the reversals. That's a misconception. Kids do not read, you're not reading it backwards. It's not backwards. You may reverse some of those, and you might notice that in a student's writing. So if you notice someone that had like a severe issue with spelling, that is often like a little bit of a red flag, or someone that is they're able to explain things in such a way and you're like, "Man, this kid is like they're so bright, but I'm not seeing this in their written work. Like I'm not I'm there's a discrepancy." Or even kids that get super tired when they're reading. Like it's takes a lot of effort or they're inconsistent. One day you're like, "Oh wow, they nailed it." And the next day you're like, "What are they doing? Are they not, why they seem like they're being lazy or they're not working hard enough. I just don't understand." Those
Right.
kinds of signs, you're like, it really is so shocking when someone explained it. I'll go on like with more things that I've noticed. But one thing that I think is so important, and I watched this on a documentary about dyslexia, and it was a while ago, but it was so interesting to me. Are you there?
Yeah. Can you
Okay,
hear me?
it froze. So I was just
Oh, I
checking.
apologize.
So it okay, if you did like an MRI and you had 2 brain scans in front of you, when they, like, tied everything up and they were like they had a person with dyslexia, there we showed their brain and we said, "Okay, what's going on?" Actually, let's start with the person who is, like, atypical, doesn't have dyslexia, doesn't have anything that is recognizable. So their reading, their language area of their brain is on fire. It is just red and flashing, and it's like that part of their brain was really working. When you look at a person with dyslexia, when they're reading, that language area is like almost gray, like not a lot of red is happening, but the rest of the brain is firing and red and going crazy. And I'm like, and they're like, so imagine how exhausted a person with dyslexia is because they have to use so much brain power to compensate in order to read the words as opposed to someone who doesn't have dyslexia. I always thought that was so interesting. And I'm like, that makes so much sense. No wonder kids get tired or it's inconsistent. Another thing is like phonemic awareness is really difficult for people with dyslexia. They tend to have an issue even with rhyming and like breaking sounds apart, putting sounds back together, that manipulating sounds. It's more difficult. I noticed with my son when we were so hardcore on the sight words, and that's something I noticed too with people with dyslexia. Any word that is visual, like you can imagine it in your mind, like the word play, those are easier words for people to see in their head because I feel like that's kind of common. But words like was, that doesn't have like a three-dimensional sign in your mind. So what I used to do with my son, we would take his action figures and we would like manipulate them to create his sight words, and then he'd trace it with his finger, and it was easier for him to then see those words three-dimensionally so that he was able to recognize, more and more. But that rote memorization is actually difficult for people with dyslexia. That's why it's harder for them to learn like quick fluent math facts that
Or
sometimes
sight
or
words.
sight words. They need like strategies in order to learn those things like in a quicker pace. Also, like fluency sometimes can be an issue. Like, and there is like, I remember reading The Art of the Slow Reader. We put so much emphasis on this
On
one
fluency.
thing. And I'm like, if it's not affecting your comprehension, and it doesn't always, like, I disagree when people say that, well, the neurological overload. And I'm like, okay, if that is happening, then yes, then we got to help with that. But if it isn't happening and they're rereading, and that slows us down when we're rereading, those are all things to make meaning. Like we're looking for making meaning in reading. We want them to understand what they've read. So what is the point of timing them if they're getting the information? Does it impact you on a test when you're slower reading? Absolutely. You won't have enough time to finish a test. but is that all that we care about? It feels like it in my state. So I understand
Yeah.
again why people would say that, but as we start to move away from that being everything, and please let us move away from it
Yes.
eventually, um,
Yes.
then we're gonna see that that doesn't necessarily have to be the thing that, like, always holds us back. So those are might be some things that you notice about your student. That the one about them being inconsistent is probably the biggest red flag because we often think that they're being lazy and they're not,
Right.
and
You
they're
know,
not.
I think it's interesting that you brought up though something that and for the record, I have never been diagnosed with ADHD. I have never been diagnosed with any form of dyslexia or learning disability formally. As I become an adult and I'm learning about these things, I'm thinking back to my own childhood, kind of like what you were saying.
Mhm,
You realize things, and I think back and I'm going, were there some things missed? Because, and I don't necessarily think, I don't specifically think it was dyslexia, but you made a very good point to the slow reader.
mhm,
So I, like you, did very, very well in school. I always was at the top of my class. I was always a straight A student. I was always getting, even through high school in my darker years, where you're off being a
mhm,
rebel, whatever. I
mhm.
still was
Me too. Yep.
maintaining high grades, right? So that's why nobody knew that I was being this little rebel because I was still maintaining high grades. Um, but I remember I am a slow reader.
Mhm,
You give me something to read. Even to this day, I don't like to, I'm not an avid reader of books. Like
mm,
people talk, I see the stacks of books that people put and they're like, I read 6 books this month. And I'm like,
mhm.
ow. I'm
Yeah.
like, how did you make yourself do that? Um, if it is a book, it has got to be something I am 100% interested in, first of all. But
Yeah.
even when I read very slowly, and I
Mhm.
have to read something because I can read a sentence or 2 sentences, and halfway through, I've forgotten what I just read,
Yeah.
and I need to go back and reread.
Mhm,
And because of that, I know I've known that about myself always. But because of that, I've always had kind of a special place in my heart and in my classroom for my kids who were slow readers
mhm.
because I like what you said, it does not affect my comprehension.
Yeah.
Once I learned, I'm gonna have to read it again. So if
Yes.
you give me a passage and then and it was even more important, and I think with our slow readers, it was even more important that we really sharpen those comprehension
Yes.
skills of how to go back and find
Mhm. And find
information,
information, absolutely. Because we
because they're
may have,
not
yeah,
going
you're
to
right.
remember it.
You're not gonna be able to hold on to it because of that, because of the time factor as well, which I also wonder, and I haven't read anything that links to this, but I wonder sometimes, like, visual memory. I'm really weak with visual memory. So, and my son, weak with visual memory. So I'm like, there's some things that I'm like, "Ooh, I wonder if that's a dyslexia thing." Because, like, when people put up notes on the board, notes down, and you're having kids copy from the board and you're
Mhm.
getting frustrated when they're taking so long to do it. For me, like, I can look at it and like 1 second later forget. I mean, I have to have it side by side. That up, down part is where I, like, lose because I don't, my memory's so weak. I then remember my principal giving me this horrible monotonous task when I was a student support specialist, and I tell him that. I'm like, "You give me the worst thing." And I had to do this whole copy paste thing of these names, and
Right.
I'm like, "I can't remember." It would make me so frustrated. And so, like, I've weak visual memory, and so I'm often wondering, like, does that happen because you have dyslexia, or is that something totally different? But I will say about the ADHD or the ADD thing, that also, it's like 12, I just read this statistic recently, 12 to 24% of people with dyslexia are often diagnosed with ADD as well. So, which I didn't even know I had ADD until I was an adult. And
Right?
yeah, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I have this too. No wonder I can't concentrate." I definitely have always
And
thought
we're
that.
girls,
Yeah,
and we're
we're
girls,
girls.
so
So you're right, and I knew it about my son, although while he was getting the dyslexia testing, they said he does have some tendencies, but he can focus. So I don't know if I would categorize him as that. But as life went on, I was like, oh, yeah, I don't know how they said we don't know because oh yes, for sure he can't sit still.
Yeah.
So that's actually gotten better. But it's just interesting how some of these things like go hand in hand.
Well, and okay, so I want to respect your time because you are a busy, busy, busy woman. And I want to make sure that I ask you this question. As a parent of a child with dyslexia, because I know you shared about your experience
Mhm.
in the classroom and drawing on that and then at from the parent perspective, what are some things you wish your son's teachers had known, had been trained in?
Mhm.
Um, yeah, just what do you wish they had how that
I
perspective. You know
okay.
what I'm trying to
I do
say.
know what you're saying. Well, first of all, I'll say personally, it was hard. I felt like school was hard in the beginning and I felt bad about myself. But watching my son struggling with school was the one of the worst pain experiences I've ever felt. And I wish that they had known. And I would tell them, like they knew because I worked at the school with them. So, but they don't know. They didn't know a lot about dyslexia. But I would say it impacts you like socially and emotionally. That's the biggest thing. Like we have to do a lot of work on building kids' confidence and helping them to see themselves as as thinkers and learners, but it just looks different for them. I wish people had known that. I wish that we were doing more multisensory activities because he's like when you look at multiple intelligence and you look at like body smart, he has to move to think. So I think if we take those kind of things in consideration, also, I remember going to his 3rd grade teacher and basically begging her to take down the data wall. I'm like, "Can we please stop with this data wall?" First of all, this isn't motivating anyone. When you are at the bottom of the data, you know who you are, and that excuse of they don't know who they are, we have to be
Yeah, because
honest
we
with
didn't put
ourselves.
their names on there. Yes,
Exactly.
they
We
do.
know
They
they
know
are, and
exactly who th
what I wanna ask people when they say that is, can we put up a data wall of weight loss in our teacher
Oh,
lounge? Can we
yeah.
put it up our financial, bank accounts on the teacher's lounge? Is that gonna motivate you to make more money seeing that you're at the bottom or lose more weight seeing that no way. You're just gonna feel like crap about yourself, and every day you're
Well,
gonna be reminded.
and it might motivate those who are, like, at the top that are really close together
Yes.
and they're doing that,
Yes.
but the ones that are down
Yeah.
here, it is not motivating for
Mm-mm.
because we know that as adults. I mean,
Mhm.
we start those weight loss journeys, and if we're, like, rocking and rolling and losing weight
Yeah.
and all that, we're, "Man, yes, let's go," but the minute we fall off and we get too far behind, we're like, "I'm not gonna win anyway, so why
No,
bother?"
because you give up, you shut
You give
down,
up.
and
Absolutely.
he would do that. He would shut down. He would make excuses. He would have to go to the bathroom on a
Mhm.
regular basis because he wanted to avoid feeling that way about himself. When kids don't feel good about themselves, they don't feel competent, and they are constantly reminded that they are right, that they aren't competent, that they shut down sometimes or they act out. That's when we have behavior issues as well. They don't feel good about themselves, and we don't even know that that's the thing, that's the thing that's hurting them.
And they don't have the emotional
No.
intelligence and the
Mm-mm.
emotional regulation skills to be able to convey what they're feeling. Um, and so, like you said, it often manifests as acting out, as
Mhm.
behavior issues in the classroom.
Avoidance, going to kids
Unfortunately,
that go to the
avoidance,
bathroom 25 times a day,
you
they're
know,
avoiding.
yeah, and it pains me to say this, but I think it's important that when we know that we made mistakes, that we admit we own our mistakes, we own up. So if you are a teacher listening to this and you're thinking about students in the past who you are thinking you're hearing some of this stuff and you're going, "Man, I remember this student and oh, I didn't handle that situation very well." I think it's very important to recognize that we all as teachers make mistakes.
Oh, yes.
And I know that in my career in the classroom, there were plenty of times, and I'm so embarrassed to admit this, but at the same time, we need to. There were plenty of times where students were just labeled as behavior kids
Yeah.
that I can now look back on after learning things that I probably should have known from the like this is training as teachers need
They
as a
absolutely,
prerequisite.
absolutely. No, there we have let kids down, not on purpose. I remember when I listened
Yeah.
to the occupational therapist talk to me about sensory issues that
Yep.
sometimes go hand in hand with dyslexia or just in general. And I'm like, "Holy mackerel, I've had kids that have had sensory issues and I had no idea."
Yep.
And I feel terrible. And I think and even when she was talking, I'm like, "Wait a minute, this is true for me. I have this issue." And it's like, you know, you don't know. And it's not like, and I really feel like your OT is like an untapped resource in schools. They know so much about so many different things. And we never give them, not us, but well, admin, whoever, never
Yeah.
gives them like the floor to like train us, teach us, tell us some things that we could do. Kids that actually their hand is hurting during writing, I used to think that was not true, even though that is
Or
me.
they're just being lazy.
Or
They
they're
don't wanna
being
write.
lazy, they don't wanna
Yeah.
write, and I'm like, "No, their hand actually does hurt, they're not gripping the pencil correctly." There's
Yeah.
there and I'm like, "I didn't know that for years." It was probably I was like 15 years into teaching, and when I read this book about it, and I'm like, "Oh, this is actually a thing. They weren't
Yeah.
just making this up. Their their hand actually hurts."
Yeah.
So,
Well,
ugh,
and I think that comes just that just speaks volumes to the pressure that teachers are already feeling in the classroom. Because I know, my audience, they're I've got some blunt teachers in my audience. I get emails all the time, but they're great. We love our community here at FHE. Um, but they are so stressed. There's so much put on them already in the classroom. And um it's not that they won't use those resources like an
yeah,
OT. Um,
it's
it's just
time.
there's so much pressure put on
Yeah,
this stinking test that
yes,
listen, we know it. We try. We have this idea that we're going to start the school year off, and this year it's not going to be about the test.
yeah,
This year I'm going to teach my students. I'm going to do what's best for my students, and trust me, by you might make it to Christmas. You
yeah,
might make it to Christmas break, but it's gonna turn into being about the test because unfortunately, that's where the pressure's put on us, especially
yeah,
if you're in those tested grades. Now, if you're in grades K through
2?
2, which are
Mhm,
in Texas are not state tested grades, there are still tests that are done
yep,
even in those grades
mhm.
because they want to make sure that when they get to third
They're
grade, they're going to start
prepared.
passing, that they're
Yeah,
prepared.
yeah.
So I don't want to forget about those grades that aren't necessarily state tested grades. But I do think it's important that we make sure that we are advocates for our students. And sometimes that comes at the expense of our own,
Mhm.
what's the word I'm looking for, Trina? Um, our own accomplishments. Because,
Mm.
you know, being teacher of the year is all great and wonderful, or being recognized because you had the highest test scores is all great and
Mhm.
wonderful. And but if a child slipped through the cracks in your classroom with something that you should have caught as a teacher, but it was
Mhm.
passed off as bad behavior, or it was passed off as a lazy student, or
Mhm.
it was passed off, which is common, passed off as these parents. It's the
Yeah,
parenting. I'm not saying, I'm just going to go ahead and say this right now. I'm
yeah,
not saying that there aren't some issues that we're dealing with in our classrooms that aren't related to parenting. Okay.
yeah.
We know this. But I think it's very important that as teachers, we take a step back and we try to bring in as many people as possible to evaluate situations before we pass things off as bad behavior,
Mhm.
laziness, whatever it is,
Mhm.
because then students like you slip through the cracks and
Mhm.
don't get the help they needed when they were in school.
Yeah.
So, for your son, um, as a parent, what and I want you to share this as a parent
Mhm.
for teachers so that that parent teacher communication can can develop in a very respectful, and
Mhm.
supportive way. As a parent, when you went to your son's teachers,
Mhm.
um, what were was it automatically accepted with, like, received?
No, it's not because well, in my state of Florida, we don't even recognize dyslexia. So they're like, "Well, that
Excuse
doesn't
me,
even."
repeat that?
Yeah, I know. Texas is really, really good about that, but Florida is not. Yes, they don't even recognize it. I had to fight to get my son a 504, and I started at a 504 and was like, "Okay, if I need to go to an IEP, I will." I mean, I had to pay over $1,000 to have him tested for dyslexia just so I could have I did outside testing. I did not go through the school system. And honestly, Farah, I know we can't diagnose students. I get really annoyed by that because
Yeah.
I often had my pediatrician telling me that I needed to get my son on Hooked on Phonics. Why are they giving me educational advice, as a doctor? So I'm not as a teacher, I think I can say, "These are the things that I've noticed. These are the things that I'm seeing." I'm not saying your child has ADD or dyslexia or whatever. I'm just saying these are the things that I notice as a professional. Now, I am not gonna tell you that I didn't tell parents that I thought their child was
Oh,
dyslexic.
absolutely, I did too.
I'm like,
Yeah,
"Mom to mom, this is what I'm seeing. This is what happened it to me. This is what I realized with my son. It is hereditary. Does anyone in your family have dyslexia?" One of my students, her dad had dyslexia. He was a genius scientist who had passed away. This child was 7. This was my 2nd grader. She, was brilliant in so many ways, but she struggled with the breaking the code of the
yeah.
written word. And I'm like, I'm just going to tell you, this is what I think. And she got tested. Yep, she had dyslexia. I went with her in when she was in 3rd grade. I wasn't even her teacher anymore. I went to the meeting in order to get accommodations for her as a like a backup because I'm like, yep, these are the things that I noticed in the classroom. And I'm like, this is the only way that you're going to get accommodations for your kids as a parent is fighting for those things like
Fighting.
504 and IEPs. And people are like, I don't want to label my child. Well, you know what? I want my kid to have a level playing field. He needs extra time. He needs to be able to read this out loud to himself in a hall or in a small room by himself so that he can process and understand. You can't do that in the regular setting, and I'm like, you have to have these things in place just so it's even a little bit fair for them. So those are the things
Yeah.
that I fought for. I did have some excellent He had some excellent teachers that learned more, they educated themselves, we had conversations, and then, of course, there were times that he didn't. I mean, I remember even in 6th grade having to come and have a meeting with the guidance counselor and all of his 6th grade teachers, and they were like, "Give me the research, give me the information. I wanna know how I can help him." It was wonderful. It was a great
Yeah.
experience. But, you don't always find that, and
Well, and I think too, as an educator, and you know this, Trina, because like you, I have to admit that there weren't times that I didn't tell parents, I really think you should think about talking to his pediatrician about
Mhm,
this
mhm,
because I'm seeing, and not just him, because my girls, I had to do it with some of my female students
mhm.
too, but it all comes down to funding. And
Yeah,
that's what it all comes down to is as teachers, we're told you're not allowed to diagnose.
yeah.
Okay, I'm allowed as a human being and as an
Yes,
educator and as a
to
professional
share my
to share with
observations.
you my observations and
Mhm,
what I see going on and what my opinion is as to what this possibly could be. But it all comes down to funding because the minute we do that, then
mhm,
schools are required to provide the testing and they don't want to pay for the testing. And quite frankly, if you're so worried about your test scores and you're so
mhm.
worried about your attendance rates and you're so worried
Exactly.
about your behavior issues and you're so worried about all this, well, I tell you what, paying for the testing might
Yeah.
eliminate all of your worries about all of that stuff to begin with. And I'm sure that there are plenty of educators out there that would gladly give up their teacher coffee machine in the workroom to pay
Mhm.
for a testing for one of their students. And I'm not saying that the coffee machine is the
Yes.
is they're not cheap
They
tests,
don't
but you
have to
know
get
what
rid
I'm
of the coffee
saying.
machine, but yes, I do know what you mean,
I
yeah.
know that there are teachers that would gladly think about the fact that, hey, we're not going to be able to provide these things because we are going to put that money into testing for our students. And I don't know a teacher worth her weight that wouldn't be willing to do that.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
um, now I will say, and this is kind of one of the last questions that I have for you today.
Okay.
Um, I have recently seen on TikTok, and I cannot remember the teacher's name, but I am going to make sure I tag it in the descriptions, show notes, and all of that. There is a teacher who shares her school, and I don't remember where her school is, but they have a sensory room for students.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it is absolutely freaking amazing. But it is there for students to come through to throughout the day, and they don't have to necessarily have gotten in trouble in the classroom. If
Uh-huh.
they're just in the classroom, they need a place to go.
Yeah, they need a break.
So this got me to thinking
Yeah, we had that at my last school, and it was, called the engine room. It
the
was
engine room.
awesome. It was so awesome, and yes, it
And
really helped a lot of kids.
I wish it was something that was required in all schools because they
Yes.
actually have turned their teacher lounge into one as well, kind of a calm down space for teachers,
Mhm, mhm.
because she talks
Oh,
a lot about how
yes.
as teachers, we have trauma. I
Yes.
mean, and I can attest to this, having had a student that had a disability for privacy reasons. I won't say what, but there were massive outbursts having to clear the classroom.
Mhm.
And this was a daily occurrence in my
Yeah.
classroom for the first semester of school, and I had to advocate so hard to get what was needed, which was ridiculous. But that's traumatic. That
Yes,
that is traumatizing
it
to a
is.
teacher, and teachers need spaces, but what about the other kids? What
Yeah.
about the other kids in the classroom? They've just experienced that too. So this idea of a room is just, I think it should be mandatory in all schools.
Yeah,
I
no,
just
I
do. It
agree.
is for the students.
Yeah.
But that was not my question. I apologize. I kind of went down a rabbit hole because it's so awesome. But my question is specifically for teachers in their classrooms, what would you, as a parent, like to see in the classroom for your son? Because I don't think parents who have students with accommodations or disabilities, I don't think they walk around thinking, my child is special, you must do blah, 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 blah,
No.
blah. But
Mm-mm.
I think that there are things that they wish teachers would try to provide, like the calm down space,
Yes.
or if they can't do it on a school level,
Mhm.
try to do something like that in your classroom. If you were talking to a teacher right now who was saying, a new teacher who was like, I want my classroom to be as close to perfect
Mm.
for any of my students who have disabilities or potential disabilities, because I don't
Yeah.
always know.
'Cause I don't know. Mhm.
They haven't been diagnosed yet. What would you tell them as a parent?
Well, I definitely would say cool down corner. I think those spaces are essential in classrooms. And I also think talking to our kids about how we think and that metacognitive piece, I actually think that goes really far with kids, even little ones. I mean, my kids used to be able to tell me, we would call it like our smarts, like I'm people smart, I'm math smart, they'd be able to say that and they would be, I'm working on being music smart, or that's what challenge for me, but I'm trying to stretch myself. We would have these conversations so that they could understand that everybody doesn't think the same. I mean, there's a book called, I think it's called I'm Dyslexic, or I have dyslexia, something like that. And we would read that. We would talk about that. We would talk about we'd talk about the benefits of some of these things as well. This makes me able to do, I'm able to see things that are going to happen before they happen. And there, I mean, that feels like a superpower sometimes.
Yeah.
So we would talk about things like that so that they would understand, all like empathy. You want to build that culture in your classroom where we're empathetic with someone that is struggling with something. And I think those things are so important to have in classrooms, and also like allow kids to not have to do it all the same. Give them some more choices. They can show what they know in a different way. If they're struggling to write it down, could they do an audio recording or like a podcast episode? Could they create a video? Could they, there's other ways to show what they know. And the whole multisensory thing is so important, especially with kids with dyslexia. and some kids, they need to move. I used to have if my kid needed to stand, not my own child, but my student needed to
Mhm.
stand, I didn't put her in the front of the room because then she would be blocking people. I just moved the desk back and she could stand as much as she wanted to. And
Yeah,
I'm like, you just being more flexible with knowing that not everyone thinks the same, and for some people conformity or like being in that one way is really difficult. It feels like torture for some kids. So really understanding that, I think that can make a huge difference.
I think that that's extremely important, and I want the audience to hear that because that just made me wow. When you said it feels like torture to the student, and I don't think any teacher would
Mm-mm.
ever want their student to feel that way. Um, Definitely not intentionally, but even
No.
unintentionally. And I think it's very important for us as educators to hear that um, as a student, we're there. Our students are not just being lazy. They're not being, you know, defiant. Their frustrations may manifest in some behaviors that look like that, but
Mhm.
when you think about what they are feeling, their lack of emotional intelligence to regulate what they're feeling, I think and to hear it feels like torture. And I think that's important for us to remember. Um, I know that if I was in the classroom right now, I probably would put that on a sticky note and put it on my computer. It feels like torture. Because I would think I would want that constant reminder every
Mhm.
day to
Mhm.
remember that for students that are dealing with these issues, it feels like torture. Well, Trina, wow, thank you so much for joining me today. I We are going to do this in two parts. So I asked Trina to join us today to give the perspective from a parent, but also having been an educator. Um, and I did not know when I asked you that you also um, have deal with this in your own life. So I did
Mhm.
not know that. So that was just a bonus to having that perspective as well. We do have a dyslexia expert coming on who is an educator and has all the trainings.
Yeah,
And
that's cool.
she is going to be coming on to hopefully in May. So I hate that we're having to do a separated episode, but it is a two-part series.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to have her on, but she wasn't available to do anything until May. And, but I think this is extremely important information to get out
Mhm.
to my audience and to teachers all over. So thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate it. And I hope that you will listen in May and then weigh
Yes.
in the groups and things like that when it gets shared
I would love to.
on
I'm
shares.
excited about that.
Yeah.
I think that's so important and so necessary, and am appreciative as a teacher, as a parent, as a person with dyslexia. So, thank you.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Trina. Now, if you're looking for more tips, strategies, and simple systems to take back into your classroom to make your teacher life easier, check out the videos on your screen. Thanks for watching and keep being an educational rock star.